Walk out the door, you see someone that you know and they ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
The most tragic character backstories in all of Honkai Star Rail. Obviously, we don't wish tragedy upon anyone, but a very tragic backstory can make for some of the best storytelling. Some of the best characters are formed from tragedy. Some are able to overcome it and elevate themselves, and others succumb to it, becoming the worst possible versions that they could be. And let's be honest, most interesting characters, whether in video games, movies, and in real life, usually have a backstory or past formed from tragedy. So I thought it would be interesting to recap the most tragic backstories within characters in Honkai Star Rail. And especially since we haven't really talked about much characters outside of amphoreus in a while. And I could think of no better place to start than our favorite IPC member, Adventurine. He is a senior manager of the Strategic Investment Department and one of the 10 Stonehearts. He holds the cornerstone, Adventurine of Stratagems. He is somebody that's able to take tragedy on the chin, and just by looking at him and talking to him briefly, you would never be able to tell just how insanely tragic his past actually is. And is currently, since we already got a trailer of the 10 Stonehearts voting whether he would live or die, because he broke his cornerstone. That is nothing compared to what this man had to endure. His real name is Kakavaja, and he is an Afghan, from a world called Sigonia, a very harsh desert world plagued with a lot of war. Adventurine's father died before he was even born, so he's been experiencing loss since the get-go. His mother died soon after, leaving just him very young with his older sister. Naturally, him and his sister lived a pretty scared life since the Afghans and the Katakans were in constant conflict on his home world. The IPC intervened to protect and mitigate the war, but naturally the IPC always has an agenda. Seeing a planet with resources, they can never refuse. Sometime before being taken in by the IPC, he was offered to join the Masked Fools but declined, and then was later imprisoned by the IPC. But Adventurine showed some promise. He was a very sharp and nifty kid, and the IPC saw something in him, especially the Strategic Investment Department. And then he was later recruited by Jade, who offered him a choice. And this was an easy choice for Adventurine, who wanted to live, offering him a new life and identity, being introduced to the world of gambling. And he quickly rose through the ranks to become one of the 10 Stonehearts, dominating his skill, being one of the most efficient Stonehearts at getting the job done, bringing planets into the fold of the IPC. But, despite his bravado and confidence, he is shown to be fearful of losing everything deep down. It is truly hard to forget such a tragic past. And despite him rising the ranks, he still bears the barcode on his neck. Adventurine might have a little bit more freedom, but he is still very much a slave to the IPC. Perhaps one day he will truly be free to follow his own path. Next, we have Rappa of the Galaxy Rangers. And at face value, Rappa just seems like a very odd individual, always talking in ninja rap language. But once you actually learn her backstory, her weird quirkiness just seems more messed up than anything. Trauma is a very interesting thing. Your brain is sometimes able to subconsciously try to shield you from it, change the way you literally perceive things. For Rappa, she is a modified, genetically engineered super soldier who pretty much grew up in a lab, one of the labs of Dr. Primitive and his followers, but was not allowed to live a normal life in the slightest, not even really treated like a human being, other than one scientist who actually pitied and felt bad for her, letting her read ninja rap comics and have at least a little sliver of joy in her experimental life. She was quite literally a test subject, not even treated like a human being, other than this one scientist giving her the bare minimum. And because of this, she adopted this ninja rap persona, and adopted that persona into everything around her, which was a clear defense mechanism, which is pretty messed up and sad. Even referring to the scientist as a master, and created this whole very comic book-like story for her own life, making her life feel much more rad and cool than it actually is. When finally she was actually able to break free from her captivity, killing some of the scientists, and the Galaxy Rangers in their pursuit of Dr. Primitive were actually able to rescue her, and then she was able to join them, still in the pursuit of Dr. Primitive and aware of her messed up situation. However, she has kept the ninja persona, since it's her only really true identity that she's ever had, and is honestly a comfort mechanism for her. and currently she is still in the pursuit of Dr. Primitive, or as she puts it, pursuing the villain known as Evil Ninja Usaru. I mean, Rappa doesn't even have an official name given to her. Her name is Test Subject aka 3. Many of the other experiments didn't even survive. At least Master Kucha, despite working for Dr. Primitive, has at least a little bit of a conscience and a heart, allowing Rappa to read his manga collection, and at least convincing Rappa that her experiments were a form of ninja training, all the painful experiments, her being a super soldier, testing her pain thresholds. At least he was able to convince her that it's part of her ninja training, so in her mind, it feels more like a positive training arc thing than just her being an actual test subject. At least there's a silver lining though. Rappa's still a pretty positive individual. She is aware of the messed up past she has had and wants to rectify it by pursuing Dr. Primitive. Next, we have Hana and Shui from the Shanzhou Alliance. Hana is one of the judges of the Ten Lords Commission on the Law Fu, and she is one of the 4 judges of detention, interrogation, incarceration, and punishment, in charge of discerning the sins of criminals and using the oracle brush to write down karmic punishments to be dished out. And because she's in close proximity to some of the worst criminals in the galaxy, mostly to do with the abundance, she has been affected by Mara, which has made her feel detached from anything worldly and any sort of happiness. She's been doing this for over 800 years. So for her, it's much more of a mundane tragedy. Only when in the presence of her sister does she ever truly feel a glimmer of hope in the world. But they describe her as a drowning soul that no longer has her individuality, dissolving into the boundless ocean of chaos and nothingness, which is really sad. Also, we got a glimpse of how terrifying the abundance actually is, and naturally being stuck with criminals for over 800 years would take its toll on you. But even in our most recent quest at the Shanzhou Law Fu with Hule, the Borisan leader, who killed her sister during that quest, we know just how scary and dangerous the abominations of the abundance actually are. In the past, her sister even got eaten by a tree-like abomination of the abundance, while Hana had to watch helplessly as her sister was eaten. But that's not the end of it. The abomination grew fruits in the shape of her sister's head and started begging Hana to join them or join us. And they were only able to ever save a part of her sister's consciousness and not her body, which is why she currently uses a puppet body for the remaining part of her consciousness. And Hana still has PTSD over 1,000 years later. And every time she thinks of this, which is often nearly every night, she has to drink herself senseless just to stop the nightmares and the trauma. That is absolutely horrific. Hana also has to drink a lot just to forget other people's trauma, since that is her job within the prison, to see people's memories, their sins, and determine their judgment or whatever punishment comes to them after they enter the prison, which over the years has taken a massive toll on her. She also feels like she needs atonement for herself for not being able to save her sister. And both sisters talk about wanting eternal rest. They both obviously cherish their time together, but at the end of the day, a long lifespan can be way more of a curse than a blessing, especially if you're living this type of life. Overall, one sister is a shell of her former self with little bits of her consciousness left within a puppet body. The other is an extremely traumatized and overworked individual. If it wasn't for each other and their love for each other, I'm pretty sure they would have let death or the nihility take them long ago. Now, you probably noticed that I'm not actually ranking these, because it can be subjective at times, especially how people react to it, like Adventurine, who kinda takes it on the chin despite his very awful past. But when it comes to Acron, she definitely ranks among the top of this video with the worst trauma and backstories. And with her, it goes much deeper than Honkai Star Rail. I made an entire video about it, but to summarize, obviously we know there's export variant versions of each character. For Acron, she's Raiden Mei, the variant of Raiden Mei from Honkai Impact 3rd, and the Raiden Shogun from Genshin Impact, and those are just a few. But when it comes to Acron, she is the worst case scenario of all the variants. Think of Peter Parker in the Spider-Verse. Think of the Peter Parker that has the worst possible scenario where everything goes wrong, everyone in his life dies, everything that could go wrong does go wrong. That is Acron, and it ain't even close. Acron comes from a planet called Izumo, populated by humans, but there was a sister planet nearby called Takamagara, which was populated by demonic beasts called Kame. But when the black sun of Nihility encroached, remember this black sun because we even see this black sun in other versions of Acron in other games. But when this happened, these demonic beasts and godlike deities from Takamagara attacked Izumo, nearly wiping out Izumo until they gathered enough remaining resources to creating some swords called Edict Edges, which are basically Honkai Star Rail's version of divine keys, like Welt has with his staff, using the bodies of dead god Kame to fight back against them. Acron lost everyone and everything she ever loved, until she was the sole survivor. Until eventually IX consumes both planets and Acron becomes an anomaly, an emanator of nihility, becoming a self-annihilator and consumed by it, but also able to control and revel in it. Revel in the misery and the complete endless nothingness that is nihility, with her ultimate goal to end this eon's life. Put it out of its misery once and for all. Acron is obviously one of the most terrifying and powerful beings in all of Honkai Star Rail, but she is definitely one of the most tragic as well. Just look at what happens when a memo keeper, Black Swan, peeks into the head of Acron. It is quite literally endless nihility and misery, and yet Acron is still able to find a purpose in her current life. I mean, nihility itself means nothingness, non-existent, or endless nothingness. And that's exactly what this eon represents, and by extension, Acron being an emanator of it. She has nothing, there is nothing, everything is nothing, worthless, nothingness. It's actually worse than being depressed or sad. Tragedy can sometimes drive you to be angry, sad, frustrated. When it comes to Acron, you don't even get that luxury. You're in the bottomless pit of nihility at this point. The worst case scenario of all Raiden Mei, and Raiden A is out there. And yet, she's still able to be optimistic about the future. Truly exceptional. Next, we have one of the most tragic backstories in the game that really hits home. Bootill, the cybernetic cowboy galaxy ranger. Very quick-witted in doing everything he can to not actually swear and get this video demonetized. Bootill only cares about one thing at this point: revenge on the IPC, especially as Waldo Schneider. Bootill grew up on a very lush and fertile planet on a farmstead, and although he was an orphan, he had one of the best childhoods you could ask for, growing up on the farm with his adoptive parents and his adoptive siblings, learning how to gunsling, ride horses, farm, and it was just a wholesome childhood. There was many towns and communities close to his farmstead. Life was pretty good, and yeah, he got into some trouble as he got older, but all normal things growing up. He eventually even adopted a daughter, and stayed very close to his family and friends his entire life, until of course the IPC found this very lush green planet, and decided they were gonna plant themselves there. I mean, why not, right? A lot of good resources here. And because Bootill's planet wasn't very technologically advanced, when they came with their robots, armies, and excavators, naturally, the inhabitants of this planet, slinging guns and riding horses, didn't stand a chance. And Bootill, being the type of guy that he is, very rebellious, he would lead a bunch of rebels against the IPC trying to disrupt their plans, which did affect them a bit, but the IPC was just too much of a juggernaut. But the rebels were a nuisance enough to draw the attention of the IPC to take more drastic measures. Then Bootill snuck on one of the IPC main ships, and then in the most tragic way possible, he overheard their plans to just rain fire down, to essentially just end the rebellion and beat this planet into submission, and Bootill was helpless to do anything about it. When they essentially started nuking the planet then, his entire family was wiped out, even his adoptive daughter, and Bootill, when he finally escaped the IPC ship and returned home, he had to bury his entire family, and in that moment he died inside. He would later then even go through one of the most painful enhancements possible, turning his entire body 90% cyborg and robotic, with only 10% flesh and humanity left, giving himself these physical and powerful enhancements to have a fighting chance. He would then even infiltrate the Garden of Recollection to learn the truth of who was behind this. He wasn't just interested in beating down goons of the IPC. They are all just doing what they're told, they're just employees. He wants to know who's in charge. As Waldo Schneider, the head of the marketing development department, And currently, Bootill's entire goal and mission in life is revenge, which is understandable. Bootill's planet was no threat to nobody, everyone living quiet, humble lives, and the IPC just implanted themselves there and slaughtered millions. But they left Bootill alive, and that will be their biggest mistake in the end. Next, we're going to be going to Amphoreus. Now, pretty much anyone in Amphoreus with the stories we've learned there, Castris, Mightios, Anexa, pretty much all the Chrysos heirs, dealing with the Black Tide, death, war, corruption. So you could make a case for any of them to really be in this video, but I'm actually going to talk about the Flame Chaser of Passage, Tribios, the Holy Maiden of Yonisapolis, and the Chrysos heirs who stole the core flame of Passage. I think what separates her from most to me is that her soul is now fragmented into a bunch of pieces, and one by one, each fragment's going to die until eventually Tribios as a whole is gone. But that's not even the saddest part. The saddest part is, I think she is longing for this. We get these flashbacks of her and her mother talking about the Sea of Flowers, which now we know is the Nether Realm. It's death. The only way to truly escape the Black Tide and this cruel world of Amphoreus is death. Death is paradise, and death is the only salvation. And Tribios cannot completely die and go to the Sea of Flowers to meet with her mother once again until all the fragments are gone. She is slowly dying one by one, piece by piece, and even leading up to becoming the Flame Chaser of Passage, inheriting that Titan's core flame. When her mother vanished, she became the new Holy Maiden of Yonisapolis. But like we know with the politics of Amphoreus, they were already plotting to have her killed, throw her off a cliff, make her disappear. So she had to take matters into her own hands and learn the sad truth of the Flame Chaser journey. Even when Tribios was young and her life was a little bit more happy, she was usually confined within their quarters for her own safety, since her mother knew the dangers of being a holy maiden. And Tribios always had a fascination with rocket ships and traveling beyond Amphoreus. It's sad to think that she might never get to know what's out there, but at least she got to meet the Trailblazer and learn some things. And I thought it was a really nice touch that we ourselves, through the passage of time, got to aid her in her own journey to become the demigod of Passage. Just overall, having to bear this burden and be the first ever Flame Chaser in this current cycle is sad in its own right. But adding everything else together just makes for one of the most tragic stories for one of the most wholesome and innocent people in the entire game. You know, we can't really have a video about tragedy and tragic character backstories without Mr. Tragedy himself, Blade. Somebody cursed with Mara and immortality that just wants to die. His home and everyone he knew was destroyed by the Abundance and its followers. So him at a young age, like many, sought refuge with the Shanzhou Alliance, and Blade would devote himself to being an excellent blacksmith and swords craftsman for the Alliance, crafting them many swords and weapons, actually making a name for himself and crafting some of the most legendary weapons on the Luofu. He would eventually form a very close bond with a Foxian pilot named Beiheng, along with Jinglu, Jin Yuan, Dong Feng, becoming a member of the High Cloud Quintet, and then learning himself how to fight and be skilled with the sword. The High Cloud Quintet would fight many battles against the denizens of Abundance, but their most difficult battle of all was against an emanator of Abundance named Shahu, where one of his closest friends, Beiheng the Foxian among their group, would sacrifice herself to kill the emanator, but she would die in the process, so they mourned. Dong Feng at the time convinced Blade that they could use the flesh of an emanator of Abundance that they just killed to resurrect their Foxian friend, but it did not go as planned and created another catastrophe, and then they would have to put down their friend for good. This was traumatic on so many levels, causing the rise of more monsters, and Jing Liu would become Mara-struck in the process, and this would lead to Dong Feng, now known as Dong Heng, being banished along with Blade. And throughout the years, Jing Liu would actually kill Blade many times during sparring matches to remind him of his past sins. Blade would also relentlessly hunt down Dong Heng, convincing him to bring back their friend, and causing Blade now to be Mara-struck immortal, living with sin and banishment. But every time he would try to kill Dong Heng would then kill him again in self-defense. But because Blade is now immortal, he keeps coming back, and is now a husk of his former self. But Elio and the Stellaron Hunters saw some potential in Blade and some use for his immortality, so Elio sent Firefly to forcefully recruit Blade. Elio made a promise that if Blade would assist the Stellaron Hunters and their scripts and their missions, then Elio would grant Blade what he longs for: death. Death and an end to this miserable life. And now all that Blade strives for is to put an end to everything. Somebody that lost his home, sought refuge, made friends, and made a name for himself, but ultimately got dragged along to commit sins and atrocities, now having to live Mara-struck and become what he hates the most. Blade lost everything to the denizens of abundance, so he despises being part of it, despises being Mara-struck, and he truly does have one of the most tragic stories in all of Honkai Star Rail, along with the person that actually recruited him to the Stellaron Hunters, Firefly, whose code name is Sam. She was formerly from the Iron Cavalry of the Glamoth Empire. She was born and created as a living weapon, a test subject that's genetically modified as a super soldier for the sole purpose to combat the Swarm. She joined the Stellaron Hunters to find the meaning of life, and among all the people in this video, Firefly has the most optimistic future ahead of her. She strives to live a normal life, find companionship, meaning, and happiness to her life. Firefly has pretty much witnessed death and war her entire life. The Glamoth Empire was a massive empire that spanned across many planets in its own solar system. But like we know, during the Swarm disaster, the Endless Swarm engulfed the majority of the cosmos. So the Glamoth Empire, an empire that even rivaled the IPC for its massive influence, created the Iron Cavalry of super soldiers to combat the Swarm, and these soldiers were very efficient at doing just that. But so many of them were slaughtered in the process that there's too many to count. Firefly has fought against the Swarm, saw many soldiers, and her entire empire fall to ruin. Everyone and everything she had ever known is gone, which makes it so bittersweet and wholesome that she found companionship with us, the Trailblazer. Firefly is somebody that lived her whole life with no real purpose. Born as a weapon, witnessing her comrades fall before her eyes, knowing one day she would fall too, paving way for those that would die in battle after her. When it comes to the people born on Eurillo 6, life is harsh from the get-go, especially if you're from the underground. Natasha is such an individual. She grew up in an orphanage in Rivet Town, which she would later run as an adult. Eurillo 6, a planet constantly affected by the Stellaron and the Fragmentum, with the monsters that come with it, and half of the civilization is ostracized to the underworld and the underground. And being that Natasha is a doctor of the underworld, she sees a lot of sickness, death, and sadness, with a total lack of medical resources. Pretty much anyone that lives in the underworld on Eurillo 6 prior to us going there and helping out with the situation with Cocolia, the Stellaron, is that the planet is slowly waiting to die. Human civilization is just hanging on by a thread, especially when it comes to the underworld. So everyone in the underworld lives a very harsh and sad life. But when it comes to Natasha specifically, there is a lot of extra burden because it falls on her shoulders, with the total lack of resources, trying to save as many as she can. But this means she's constantly surrounded by death. With that said though, Natasha is underratedly one of the most resilient characters in the entire game, and without her, the people of the underworld would not even have survived long enough to see the light, to come to the surface once again. There are even some dialogues with her character story where she has patients that are going to die and they're clinging to life, scared, crying, frantic, and it's on her to calm them down while not being able to lie to them either. Like, I don't care what anyone says, that is mentally exhausting and just traumatic. And it's not traumatic for a short period of time, like a war just hits you. This is the entirety of the lives that they lived. And to boot, Natasha is an orphan herself, not having the luxury of the upbringing of her own parents and family, all the while the Supreme Guardian orders blockades to separate the overworlds and the underworld, literally leaving the people of the underworld to fend for themselves and die if it comes to it. I know it's been a while since we've been to Belobog, but I do plan on recapping the entire history of that world in a future video that I'm currently working on. And finally, the last person in this video that we're going to talk about is the watchmaker from Penacony, Mikhail Carr Legwork, whose story is tragic but bittersweet at the same time. I thought that'd be a great last character to talk about in this video. the man responsible for shaping Penacony the way it is today, known as the father of Penacony. He was a former mechanic on the Astral Express and a nameless, but decided to stay in Penacony to help once it was trying to establish itself after freeing itself from the control of the IPC, because Penacony was an IPC prison before it became Penacony with the family, being the pioneer to transform Penacony into the planet of festivities, along with 2 other nameless companions that stayed with him. Mikhail's entire story isn't completely tragedy because he had a pretty good childhood growing up on an ocean-like planet and got to live a very fulfilling life. I think what's sad about his story is that he was so alone for so long. His fellow nameless crewmates, Tiernan and Rosalina, both died, helping combat the swarm. And then with the family itself, their inner workings, and politics and corruption, Mikhail would do his best to protect the dreamscape in Penacony, where his tombstone can be found to this day at Dreamflux Reef, a little bit of a safe haven within the dreamscape. Dying alone but not really able to fully rest in peace until knowing his legacy would not be tarnished by the family or any intruders with ill intentions. Not to mention, the watchmaker had to watch Penacony, a place he spent his life building up, be overtaken by the Order. And by the end it's revealed that the watchmaker had a desire to board the Express again and continue his travels, but he never got to. But at least in the end, Penacony was able to be saved from the Order by none other than future Nameless, us. And that's gonna wrap up the most tragic stories in Honkai Star Rail and its characters. Again, I did not rank this because it feels odd to rank different tragedies, since it can be subjective. Clearly there are some things that are worse than others, but for the most part, when you're talking about extreme tragic stories from different characters, it's really hard to rank it. And of course, if you can think of another character that maybe I missed, or a character that you feel also has a very tragic story, feel free to leave it in the comments. But thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and as always, we will see you on the next one. Later.